Senator Pam, thank you so much for joining us here on GV Wire. Big question is, do you plan to introduce any legislation this upcoming session regarding vaccines?
Well, it is a matter of the fruition of those discussions. We've looked at a variety of different options. So legislation certainly is one of them, regulatory approaches, other types of approaches as well. And so as those discussions evolve, we'll have some more clarity as to exactly what next steps will be.
Okay, do you think anything by Friday for the initial deadline?
No, probably not by Friday. The discussions aren't that far along.
You mentioned vaccine rates, so I'm wondering, at what rate do you feel is necessary for the community to be safe? What's the magic number there?
Not what I feel. The actual number based on the research is for measles, you need to have a vaccination rate above 94%. That is the rate generally determined to be able to prevent an outbreak of measles. That's the most contagious disease. Other diseases, a lower immunization rate would still maintain community immunity, but measles is above 94%.
Now, you mentioned the issue of doctors, and you in the past have called them abusing their power, you can even use the term fraudulent, for writing medical exemptions. What do you base that off of?
Well, first of all, when you advertise that for a fee, you will grant a medical exemption or you'll evaluate a patient for medical exemption, for cash, that probably isn't, that doesn't sound like that's the normal course of business. You should be able to determine whether someone needs a medical exemption if they're your patient. You've been taking care of them on an ongoing basis. You don't advertise for, if you want a medical exemption, come see me. It's like, if you want patient care, you come see me, right? So that's suspicious. Some of the public health officers have reviewed the medical exemptions that have been granted because they get submitted to the schools, and they have indicated that many of those medical exemptions seem somewhat suspicious. They're certainly not consistent with the standard of care, and so that raises issues. So both because we see physicians going around advertising, we also know that the anti-vaccine community circulates lists of what they call vaccine-friendly physicians, which is sort of an odd name because they're not friendly. What they're doing is they're abetting people not getting their children vaccinated, and thereby it's really about endangering other children at the school. I mean, that's what SB 277 was about. It's not punishment for people who don't want to vaccinate their children. In fact, they can choose not to do so. They have options like homeschooling or independent study. It's about protecting the other kids at school. You have children attend school who are at risk if they get exposed to the disease, like it mentioned, and we need to keep them safe.
So my question follow-up is what would future legislation look like? Would there be any more, consequences for parents who choose not to vaccinate their children or vaccinate them at the recommended schedule? Would you apply this to homeschool? I mean, what would future legislation look like?
No, so the issue is really about the physicians who are basically violating their their professional ethics. They're not following the standard of care and actually putting the public at risk. And so, for example, the state of West Virginia, one of the other states that does not have non-medical exemptions, they actually don't allow physicians to write medical exemptions. What happens is that if you want a medical exemption, you ask your doctor to submit an application to the State Department of Health, and their health department reviews that application and then makes a decision whether to grant a medical exemption or not. So they've withdrawn that authority from all physicians in their state, or they've never granted it to their physicians, I guess. And so it's been determined by the Department of Public Health. And so then they can be sure that the standard of care is applied. So certainly that is one example. There's other states that also have require review by their health departments as well. And so that is one of the ways to address this. The other issue that we have in California is that the medical exemption right now actually only goes to schools. Now, schools don't really have the capacity to evaluate whether that medical exemption is appropriate or not. In fact, by law, there's no review of the medical exemption. The doctor writes a medical exemption, it goes to the school, and the school has to accept it. So then the issue is that, well, what happens when we have someone writing an inappropriate or fraudulent medical exemptions? Then there needs to be an ability to actually monitor both how many and the nature of the medical exemptions being written by physicians. And so those exemptions perhaps need to be going to a central database, so that can be reviewed by the medical board. And if the medical board finds that someone is acting unprofessionally, then can sanction them. Because right now, for example, the medical board has been able to sanction a physician, Dr. Bob Sears, who they showed provided inappropriate care. However, that was because there was a family willing to provide that information to them. In this case, the challenge is that for most cases, the families and the physician are in cahoots with each other around this fraud. And so it becomes very difficult for the medical board to get the kind of information they need to address this problem, because it's the public that gets harmed. There's no one who there isn't someone who's able to complain on behalf of the public, right? And they have to get medical records. However, if there is a database where there's information on the types of and frequency of medical exemptions being written, that is something then the medical board could perhaps apply and use to investigate physicians who are behaving inappropriately or unethically.
Ryan, just to be clear, this only future vaccine legislation only applied to the right to go to school, wouldn't apply to homeschool, wouldn't apply to other everyday activities that a parent and child may engage in the public.
Exactly, and I would just point out again, unfortunately, the people opposed to vaccines are making claims that, we're forcing them to be vaccinated. Actually, no, they have a choice. They can choose whether they're vaccinated or not. In order for a child to get vaccinated, parents have to give informed consent. No child's being vaccinated without their consent. And if they choose not to vaccinate, there's a consequence. And the consequence isn't to punish them or their child, although there's certainly their child deserving of protection. I think one can, we could argue about that choice, but we're not actually imposing it on them. The parents can still choose to leave their child vulnerable to these diseases by not vaccinating them. However, what we can't do is allow them to risk other people's children. Right. And that's why SB 277 is about. It's about protecting the other kids at school, the other parents who decide to choose differently or perhaps don't have a choice. And so actually SB 277 really is about giving parents a choice. It's about the idea that your child, you can protect your own children when they go to school. Right? Your choice, that when you really have a choice, that choice is there, and that you have the freedom to be free from disease when you go about your community and you send your children to school.
That's Senator. One final question. I appreciate making time for us today. Should vaccine makers be liable for injuries and side effects caused by their product?
So they actually are. And so fascinating enough, so one of the things that the anti-vaccination people, say, well, the pharmaceutical companies are not liable. Actually, they are. And in fact, the system we have now was actually created because of lobbying by an anti-vaccine organization, the National Vaccine Information Center, or when they misnamed organization, but that's an anti-vaccine organization led by Barbara Lowe Fisher, who's opposed to vaccines. And they actually lobbied for and were successful. They were successful in lobbying for a law that says that, if your child was injured by a vaccine, you actually don't even need to go through a proof, to provide proof that your child was actually injured, that you can get compensation from this compensation fund. In fact, we'll pose a tax on vaccine makers to create a fund that if you have an injury that's on what's called table injury, so then you'll have a special master, and they'll pay for your, not only for the injury, they'll pay your, or purported injury actually, doesn't actually have, you don't have to link it to the vaccine. You just have to say, this thing happened, and actually they'll pay your attorney fees, they'll pay, they'll pay the result of that event that happened that you say it's according to the vaccine, as long as there's some, so there's a table of events that if they happen after you get vaccinated, whether it's actually caused by the vaccine or not, you get compensation, and your attorney gets compensation as well for bringing that up. Okay, so that's a pretty good deal, because normally if you want to go to court, you have to go to court and get a lawyer, and you might lose, and you have to explain and prove. You have to prove this. So right now you don't have to prove it. However, I'd also point out the way the law is structured is that if the vaccine manufacturer actually did something wrong, there was they actually did something, they were negligent or they did something harmful, you can actually go to court and sue them. Okay, but you first go through this other process, and in fact, what the most telling thing is that most of the people who go through this fund, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, after they go through that process, they almost never go to court if they lose. Okay, because the standard of proof is very low in this compensation program. Unlike if you actually go to court. If you go to court, you've got to really prove that there's a link between the two. And unfortunately, most of the time, they can't actually show there's actually a link. So the table injuries are based on things that are that theoretically possible, that are research has shown that there may be a link. And so if you can just show you have a so-called a table injury, doesn't have to prove that it's actually from the vaccine, then you actually get compensated for that. And so it's kind of like you said, well, the vaccine manufacturers are shielded from liability. They are not. They are not shielded by liability. And in fact, an anti-vaccine organization that successfully lobbied for the bill. So they got what they wanted.
Right. Hey, Senator Pan, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.